We're Cox Communities, a division of Cox that delivers solutions to apartments and single-family homes. Our entire purpose is to help you meet and then exceed your business goals. We do this by partnering with you, developing a relationship so that we can truly understand your unique needs, and then offer customized solutions that fit your community. We've invested billions of dollars into our infrastructure to bring you best-in-class service and products like gigabit internet, managed Wi-Fi, bulk services, and a move-in ready pre-installed program. Plus, when you partner with us, you get a single end-to-end provider who supplies the service, the network, and a dedicated support team. Best of all, innovative digital amenities get your property future-ready while increasing value, occupancy, and resident satisfaction. At Cox Communities, we have one job: to work for you by working with you. Let's talk.
We're opening the door to better financial services, better experiences, better partnerships, better technology, better communities, and a better future.
Not on yet. There you go. Good morning, everybody. What a wonderful couple days we've had together after 2 years of not being together in person, to have over 600 people in attendance, getting to see each other and share about our experiences over the last couple years and look ahead to the years ahead, and over 300 virtual attendees. And I know many of them are joining us today on our last day of the conference. Also a wonderful time of content and hearing about best practices yesterday and the day before. Some amazing Virginia Housing Awards and best practices we celebrated. We celebrated some of the legends in housing and community development last night at our reception, and I thank all of our legends in housing who are retiring, and we know we're gonna still be calling upon you all as we all work in the weeks and days ahead. We're really excited to wrap up our conference with a closing plenary entitled On the Horizon, a 2022 Housing and Community Development Outlook. We have an amazing group assembled representing some of our key housing and community development stakeholders. We're concluding with this panel because we are living in a moment of unprecedented resources and debate around housing and community development at the local, state, and federal level. We are in the middle of a transition in terms of a change in leadership in the House of Delegates and Governor's administration, along with unprecedented debate on the role of the federal government in housing policy. We are all stewards of unprecedented emergency resources, but the future of long-term investments and elimination of barriers to the construction of affordable housing is still being debated. A huge thank you to all of you and our panelists for your leadership in raising the profile of housing and community development as bipartisan issues, and for your tireless efforts to serve Virginia. As representatives of some of the key housing and community development stakeholders in Virginia, we're looking forward to this panel's analysis of the past couple years and their advice and counsel on what to look for on the horizon in 2022. In terms of format, I'll do some very brief introductions, and then I'll ask two questions to the panel members, one looking more back and one more looking forward. But then we're going to open the rest of the time for questions either in person or online. So we'll have mic runners, and then we'll also have questions coming through to my iPhone up here from everyone across Virginia. So be thinking of those questions. So moving from my left to the right, I'm going to introduce our panel. First, we have Andrew Clark. He serves as the Home Builders Association of Virginia's Vice President of Government Relations. Andrew manages HBAV's government affairs and regulatory programs, as well as their Build PAC. He's their chief lobbyist and works with members of the Virginia General Assembly and Virginia's regulatory agencies to ensure housing affordability is taken into consideration when policymakers craft laws and regulations for Virginia. Next, we have Dr. Lisa Sturdivant, who currently serves as the chief economist for the Virginia Realtors, leading the association's research and housing market and economic conditions research throughout the Commonwealth. She's been involved in research in economic, demographic, and housing market issues and local housing solutions for more than 20 years, and she also conducts research and analysis to support the real estate industry in the Commonwealth. Next, Monica Jefferson is the interim president and chief executive officer of Housing Opportunities Made Equal of Virginia. For the last 3 years, Monica served as the vice president and chief operating officer of HOME, managing the internal operations and program administration. She has over 25 years of experience in administration, organizational development, mortgage lending, training and facilitation, and human resources planning. Monica consults with nonprofit organizations for technical assistance and developing partners and stakeholder relationships. Michael Wong is next. He serves as the president of the Virginia Association of Housing and Community Development Officials. He's also the executive director in his day job at Harrisonburg Redevelopment and Housing Authority. Under his leadership, the authority has expanded housing choice vouchers from 323 to 958 vouchers and increased the authority's owned affordable housing units from 100 to 279 units. Our last panelist is Brian Koziel. He's the executive director of the Virginia Housing Alliance. He has worked for over 9 years in the housing world, having spent most of that time as the director of research at Housing Opportunities Made Equal. He has also worked on a variety of housing-related topics, including access to opportunity, affordability, mortgage lending, foreclosures, unemployment, health, and transportation. He served as a consultant to local governments across the country, helping them to advance equitable housing policy. And the Housing Alliance has been one of the chief founders of the Virginia Housing Trust Fund and helped pull together a coalition of stakeholders throughout the pandemic to work together on housing. So as you can see, let's give our panelists a round of applause and welcome them. So I'm going to start from my left to right the first time and right to left the second time, so folks can bounce off each other of what you'd like to say. But our first question is about the pandemic's impacts on the economy. So I want to ask each of you to reflect on and share with the audience how the pandemic's impacts on the economy, health, education, and almost every aspect of life really only further validated the work that all of us in the room and online are doing to focus on the importance of housing. Each of you, please share with us key takeaways and lessons learned from the pandemic and any highlights of recent data and research regarding the importance of housing and community development. So we'll start with you, Andrew.
Excellent. Well, good morning. Can you hear me all right? All right, excellent. Well, good morning. Don't start my timer yet, because I think just kind of hearing your introduction, really want to thank Eric for inviting me, but also for the last 18 months going through a pretty crazy time. You and your staff, Pam, with rent and mortgage relief, pretty remarkable program, top in the country. Cindy Davis, I see my friend Cindy over there, who I think jump-started the first regulatory process to start once the pandemic hit and we went virtual, which is pretty remarkable. So your staff is, I think, just a round of applause for everything you guys have done too. So anyway, so I'll start in. I think, and I had to write my notes because these questions are kind of deep and I could drone on for hours, and nobody wants that because it's Friday. But really the biggest takeaway for me, two things, one kind of smaller, one bigger picture, really the importance of innovation, at least on the home building and land development side. COVID threw everything into orbit and people had to change kind of their life, the way they're working, and the same for the housing industry. You've got builders who had to figure out more efficient ways to run their job sites, to get crews into the field, how to interface with local governments, how to do plan reviews virtually, and all those things are, it's not rocket science. It's pretty straightforward, and probably everybody in this room said, why aren't they doing that decades ago? But the pandemic really forced the question, and I think that's good for the industry, it's good for the consumer, and I think those things are really going to continue, and it just really highlights that a pretty old school industry at times can actually learn new tricks, which is, we all love seeing that. So that's kind of takeaway number one for me. The second kind of more high level, I guess, and everybody in this room is a believer and understands how kind of dire our housing situation is. But, the most interesting piece was just how tenuous it is in good times and bad. So we were in a period of pretty strong economy up to 2019. Then 2020 comes, the world shuts down. Folks that were lucky to survive through things and to be unaffected in their jobs, they could buy a house, they could renovate their house, and they were doing more or less just fine, uninterrupted. Folks on the other end who lost their jobs or furloughed and couldn't pay their rent or fell behind, their ability to find housing stability just completely went out the window. Kind of next step, the economy starts to improve. Builders have what some would consider a record year in many regards. I think the Realtors report said $52 billion in economic impact, $2 billion in local tax revenue in the most odd economic times ever. And you would think, logically, well, maybe that's closing the gap a little bit and we're going to, kind of pick things up. But the reality is that every time we've kind of dug out a mess, we're so far behind to begin with that, we're kind of maintaining. And so, that's a really long-winded way of saying personally, as I've kind of reflected, makes you realize just really how much work has to get done and how we really have to step up, I think, and double down on our efforts because we're all kind of doing it and living in the trenches every day. But times like this pop up and it just sets us back a little bit. So that's my trying to summarize kind of overview and takeaways and lessons from the last 18 months.
Thanks, Andrew. Lisa?
Thanks, Brian. Thanks for stealing my thunder there, Andrew, on the study. I think we're going to hear a lot about how unprecedented COVID has been on so many different levels, and I think we're going to talk a lot about that very important issue about how different parts of the economy, different parts of our community were impacted very differently over the last 18 months. And as we sort of look ahead, as we talk about looking ahead, how to make sure that the people who have been left behind are brought into the conversation about where resources are going. I do want to talk a little bit about the recent study that the Virginia Realtors did with George Mason University that highlighted something I think is important for that I talk about a lot is how to make the case that housing is not only important to families, housing is not only important to communities, but housing is also critically important to the strength and resiliency of our economy. Right? And some people don't fall in line with the good for families argument. Some people are like not buying the good for communities argument, but those are the people that might be front and center to hear how housing is important for economic growth and economic resiliency in the state. So we looked at what the housing sector did during 2020, which, as Andrew mentioned, an incredibly economically challenging time. And we looked at the housing sector kind of writ large. So this is the home buying sector, so realtors, mortgage lenders, appraisers. We looked at the new construction side, builders, remodelers, property managers, nonprofits, the whole spectrum of the housing sector here in Virginia. And we found that the housing sector contributed nearly $52 billion to economic activity here in Virginia at a time when economic conditions were really uncertain in many sectors of the economy. So that's the first thing we found. There are four things I want to mention. And in that support of the economy, the housing sector supported over 325,000 jobs just through the activities of you all sitting in the room, of builders out on job sites, of realtors and lenders working with clients. Supported 325,000 jobs. The second point is that, to emphasize something Andrew said, is the housing industry demonstrated incredible adaptability and innovation during this time. And we were very fortunate that in Virginia, the real estate market and the housing industry was able to continue to operate. In some other states, that wasn't always the case. And we did see sort of a slowdown on the home sales side, for example, in May and June of 2020, but rebounded very quickly as folks pivoted and adopted new technologies. But that resiliency and innovation, we were talking earlier about like what will stay with us after, kind of in the after times. And some of that innovation on the builder side and certainly in other segments of the economy is going to be important. The third thing that I think is really important to mention is that when we talk about the economic impact of the housing sector, we can think about the other key parts of our economy, right? Federal government, manufacturing, all those things are super important to our economy. Housing is one of the very few sectors that hits every single community across the Commonwealth, right? Federal government's big presence in Northern Virginia, down here in Norfolk, we have manufacturing hubs, but the housing sector is everywhere. And we saw actually some of our smaller communities saw a surge in home sales activity, at least, during the pandemic, bringing that activity further. And then my last point, not only does housing touch the entire Commonwealth, but it turns out that housing, when we did our economic impact analysis, it touches almost every other sector of the economy, right? So you can imagine that when somebody, let's say someone buys a home, there's all the parties involved in that transaction, but then there's movers, and there's retail, and there's financial services, and there's nonprofits. And it turns out that housing has a great reach into all sorts of sectors of the economy, which, like I said, was really important during 2020 when so much uncertainty existed in so much of our economy. So there are so many other important things that happened during the pandemic and so many stories that I know we want to hear about, and so I just wanted to make sure that from the economic side of it, if you're looking for information, if you're looking for resources, I think that's one story we tried to tell here in 2020. Brian, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you so much, and thank you for that research being so timely at this critical moment. Monica.
Thank you, Eric. Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here and be a part of this panel. Thank you for having me. I think a couple of takeaways that we have as an organization that really focuses on systemic housing inequities and issues is the housing insecurity. This has really impacted low-income renters, the BIPOC community, and more than 10 million households spend more than 50% of their income on rent. And so we're seeing individuals who were already severely cost burdened prior to the pandemic continue to fall further and further behind due to the fact that those individuals were struggling to pay their bills and make ends meet. We know that many families have fallen behind on their rent and continue to accumulate just a multitude of debts that they cannot pay. I think what the pandemic did, it did not create a housing crisis. I think it just basically exposed and elevated what the issues were already there, particularly for our low income and our extremely low income and communities of color. And I think also during the pandemic, it really started to showcase the disparities between races as well. And then I want to share some stats with you all that I found that were interesting, that 20% of renters do not have any liquid savings at all in the bank. Rental housing shortage supply, about 7 million homes for extremely low income. So we know, I'm preaching to the choir here, that there is an affordable housing shortage. 1 in 5 renters only qualify for for federal assistance and actually receive it. And so again, this is an opportunity for us to think about, what does the post-pandemic housing environment look like? Because even though we've been fortunate enough here in Virginia to be leading around emergency rental assistance, that's only a piece of the puzzle. That's only a Band-Aid. And so as we look to move beyond that, what are we going to be able to do to support those extremely low incomes, those who are severely cost burdened, those who do not have access to affordable housing? And I think it's an opportunity for us to really start strategizing and looking beyond, what that looks like and the impact that it has on families in Virginia. The other issue that my organization has been involved in is evictions. And so we were one of the leaders in the city of Richmond area with administering an eviction diversion program with the city of Richmond, and it was a collaborative partnership with the legal aid community and other legal issues. And we know that Richmond, along with Petersburg and other counties, were noted in Matthew Desmond's eviction lab data set of having some of the highest eviction rates in the country. And Richmond was noted to be second in that regard. And so I know that there have been programs that have been created and developed to address the eviction and diversion space and look beyond how we can address those individuals to not even get to the courthouse, but really put things in place that can prevent them from being evicted. And so we've been fortunate enough here in Virginia to have the General Assembly over the last year approve several state protected evictions that will remain through June of 2022. But I think that we need to look beyond that and to really get to the root issue and cause of why we're still struggling with the issues of evictions. And so I'm hoping that all of the great minds in this room can really think about things that we're doing. I know that DHTD has their pilot program, VERP, but there is still some other issues that are tied to evictions that we do need to address and come up with some creative, innovative ways to address those challenges.
Thank you, Monica. Michael?
Thank you, Eric. And it's an honor and privilege to be here speaking on behalf of the Virginia Association of Housing and Community Development Officials. Our association is probably one of the oldest housing associations in Virginia, established in 1940 and has name change in 1970 when the ability to do community development and redevelopment was enacted. Currently, we have 41 members. They are comprised of redevelopment housing authorities and units of city government that provide housing services. They all administer either housing choice voucher, Section 8 programs, public housing, Section 9 programs, or community development programs. Our membership is very diverse in regard to size, program delivery, and the challenges they face. We have members in the very far Southwest with the largest authorities located in the urban crescent, the Richmond, Portsmouth, Newport News, Norfolk, Hampton Roads area. One of the biggest takeaways that we have identified, and the public housing agencies feel a critical need in the Commonwealth. They currently, between the public housing and housing choice voucher program, annually house over 65 families nightly. this, during the pandemic, identified that this is a critical resource to be able to support those that are most vulnerable at the lowest income levels in all communities. The agency's membership actively pivoted during COVID, utilizing KILLS Act funds and other resources to be able to provide supportive services and to be able to assist residents and be able to address the pandemic. The other takeaway from the pandemic is the need to continue to transform these programs, Housing Choice Voucher, but most especially the public housing program, from a historic wall model of housing to a more supportive services model. Many of our members have made great strides in regard to this renovation and transformation of the public housing to either new platforms or new service delivery models. But the pandemic clearly showed that there was much work to be done, and there are significant challenges to be able to address that. To be able to preserve this critical housing resource, it has to be recognized as not just our problem or not just their problem, but it's a community problem that we all have to work together, that even with the historical investment at the national and state level, it will not address the legacy of disinvestment within the public housing system. To preserve this, it will take all of us working together to be able to address this need and provide that level of housing resources for the most vulnerable community. I do want to recognize Virginia Housing for their support and partnership. They provided critical pandemic funding that was very flexible and was utilized and allowed us to be very innovative in regard to be able to address all residents and communities' needs.
Thank you, Michael. Brian?
Good morning, everyone. Can you all hear me? This on? Can you hear me now? Okay. So very nice to be here with all of you all this morning, and all of you virtually as well. I know that there are people watching virtually. I think honestly, it's been kind of tough to process the last 18 months to 2 years. It's been, it happened so fast and was so kind of, so overwhelming, right? Like I don't know how you all feel, but I feel like I need a little bit more time to process as we kind of unwind from COVID. That'll probably take all of us years to do, right? So the big takeaways, right, is that the pandemic just exacerbated existing structural inequalities across every aspect of our country, right? And so we know that some of us were able to work from home and stay safely sheltered. Some of us had to go back to offices or were doing direct client services and honestly on the front lines of a global health pandemic, right? So, the big takeaway for me is the resiliency and the amazing people that work in the affordable housing spectrum, right? Because there was a national eviction moratorium, right? Like I think about a lot of wild stuff in the housing space. I've never ever contemplated of like, oh, we should have a national eviction moratorium. Like that's huge, unprecedented. We not only did that, but in Virginia we've, thanks to Eric's leadership at Virginia Housing, pumped hundreds of millions of dollars out to people in need to keep people safely housed in a very short amount of time. And the ability for a state agency to adapt and respond, get feedback from folks, put it into practice and play is just I mean, it was as unprecedented as the pandemic was. But I think that moving forward, if there was no opportunity for a reset in the housing world, this was it, right? And so it benefits all of us to take this time to kind of reflect back and recognize that, hey, things weren't working great for a lot of folks. And it's time to realign, take this time, realign resources, commitments, collaborations, respect the voices of the people that are that we serve, uplift those voices, and put those words into practice. One of the things I just kind of recently found out about a couple weeks ago, and was just such a gut punch, was the fact that since evictions have slowed in Virginia due to the moratorium, but then also the quasi moratorium that we have now, which is ensuring that everybody's going through RRP, is that the length of stay in homeless shelters has gone from, I think, about 30 days to upwards of 70 days. And the reason why is because we were relying upon evictions to move people out of homeless shelters. Right? So in order for somebody to come out of shelter, somebody had to lose their home. And that's not just, right? That's not what justice looks like. That's not a fair and equitable housing system. And so we have the resources. We certainly have the knowledge and the collaboration that I think, in the sense of urgency that we have all learned and have kind of has been embedded in us over the past 18 months to solve that. Like, we can end that cycle. We can dedicate, I mean, on any given night, 6,000 people experience homelessness across the state of Virginia. We can end that if we all work together, put our minds to it.
Well, thank you all for reflecting on the past pandemic period. One thing I heard that I would challenge everyone to think about is, some people talk about this period being a great pause or an opportunity to look at the way things were, and most of the speakers talked about ways we can maybe do things differently in the future based on what we've learned. I would challenge everyone. I think the hardest thing about it being a great pause is it has been, but no one has had time to really reflect because everyone's been so busy and beaten down. Your teams are, in this space are feeling stressed. And so I would challenge everyone to take, sometimes it's like I think Brian said at the end, it's challenging to really think about and reflect on it all, because there's been hard times for all of us personally and professionally, but I think it's really critical, and challenge everyone to jot something down that you'll do with your teams when you go back, to think about some things we learned that we could do differently in the future as an organization, as a society, as a commonwealth, and also take some time to celebrate some of the work that's been done over the past couple years, because we've also not had enough time. I don't know how many celebrations I've had with people at this conference that happened 17 months ago about some little thing we all did together, but it's not the same kind of celebration when it's just on a Zoom or over a phone call. So I would really recommend that. And I do want to say honestly that one of the things I enjoy most about working in this Commonwealth is that in our space in housing community development, stakeholders, we don't agree on everything, right? But during this pandemic, a lot of states had legal fights and different kinds of things around. I've never seen tenant and landlords come together in this way, to see building code officials and home builders think about new ways to train and keep the construction industry going, realtors and appraisers thinking about new ways to do things. People really stepped up and were collaborative in spaces that it's hard to be because there's differences of opinion, but I really appreciate everyone. I know it's somber a bit, but I appreciate everyone taking that time to reflect on that and encourage folks to do the same. So with that, we're going to turn to our second question, and we're going to look more forward. The future of federal housing investment policy is being vigorously debated at the federal level. And I don't know about you all, but it seems to change daily. It's really hard to keep up with. There's lots of big numbers, big investments in all the programs we've been working on. But that debate is still underway. And the state, the Commonwealth of Virginia, is playing an increasing role in advancing housing investments. So I want to ask each of the panelists, and we'll start with Brian, to please highlight one or two key decision points coming up for housing and community development stakeholders and policymakers. And what advice do you have for our attendees in person and virtually on how they can engage in this debate? So that's, and then also if you have any reflection on what you predict 2022 looks like for housing and community development stakeholders. Give us your crystal ball. So Brian?
Sure. Go from one worst case scenario going last to the other one going first.
Just popcorn it around. Just call somebody out.
You guys can do that if you
So the big federal bill, right, in historic investment is the Build Back Better Act. It was started, I think, it started at a $3.5 trillion price tag. For those of you all that are interested, the next number after a trillion is a quadrillion. I had that conversation this morning. $3.5 trillion, huge amount of resources in, or housing resources embedded within that legislation. It has now since been whittled down to, I believe, 1.75 trillion, with currently $65 billion for public housing, $25 billion to expand rental assistance, the voucher program, and $15 billion for the National Housing Trust Fund, as well as provisions to expand the National Low-Income Housing Tax Credit, National Low-Income Housing Tax Credit, and fix and kind of make some of the much needed reforms in that. So these are resources that are unprecedented at the federal level, and will do a lot in Virginia as they will across the country. So we have been working very hard with our congressional delegation to get them to support the legislation. Both of our senators have made statements that they are in support of the housing provisions, the dollar amounts, and Build Back Better, and so they are on recess until next week. So I wish I had some updates for you on that. But the beauty of the state legislature is that there's a start and end. And there's light at the end of the tunnel. With federal legislation, it's just ongoing, and it becomes a crisis every, approximately 6.5 days. You have to go back and get people on board. So on that note, the Housing Alliance, if you're not involved, you can go to our website. You can sign up to receive action alerts. You can contact your legislators. We make it super easy, and get involved that way. At the state, I think our biggest opportunities are really continuing to work to expand the Housing Trust Fund. As we get more money in that fund, we can do more with it. We can do different things with it. But I know that I was just had a conversation with some folks that were heavily involved in getting the trust fund created 10 years ago, and it's been kind of bouncing around 3 million, 7 million, 4 million, and we've now got some actual dollars in that fund, and we are going to work to continue to increase those resources. And then also, I mean, Build Back Better is not the only thing at the federal level. We've still got CRA reform on the table. There is also GSE reform and affirmatively furthering fair housing, which had kind of undergone some restructuring under the Obama administration and got pulled under the Trump administration, and that is now back on the table. So a lot of exciting opportunities, not only nationally, but also in Virginia.
Thank you, Brian. Michael?
Thank you. I think on the national level, it's going to be continue the debate in regard to the future of public housing, whether to continue to invest and address the critical needs, or to look at a redesign of the program. HUD has been, and the federal government has historically not made a final decision in regard to the future of public housing and the investments required to maintain it. They have proposed numerous different types of programs, from rental assistance demonstration, demo dispo, to even RAD to PhilCoff to be able to address the challenge. So where public housing goes in the future is really unsure. I think another big question mark on the national level is the will and desire to end homelessness. With the proposed universal voucher and the investment in the rental assistance programs, there is the potential capacity to provide the rental assistance needed to serve the most vulnerable in our community. This is also a site and opportunity at the state level with the investment from Virginia in the Housing Trust Fund and Permanent Supportive Housing, the allocation of resources to the Department of Behavioral Health for permanent supportive housing, and the emergency housing vouchers provided to the Commonwealth. Those are all additional resources that we can make a significant impact on the homelessness. I was late in registering to come into this conference, and so I was unable to get a hotel room right here at this facility. So my hotel is about 3 blocks away, and it's disarming to just right where we are to see people at 7 o'clock at night taking the cardboard boxes and laying down right beside the parking deck. We in this nation should not have that be accepted in any way possible. So I think we have tremendous opportunities ahead of us. Echoing what Eric has said, this has been challenging and exhausting time, and it's how we can be able to pivot, to be able to actualize and utilize these resources, given the structural challenges that we have with all service delivery models. So coming up with new innovative strategies to be able to provide all housing services, really engaging individuals with lived experience and have them part of the design process and walking through the implementation process. If we do not do that, then our future is going to be similar to our past, where we will develop flawed programs without actually having those that will benefit from them be able to have ownership and investment in those programs. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael.
The lookout for, I think, the space that HOME operates in, and for those of you all who don't know, HOME is Virginia's premier fair housing organization. We tackle systemically divisive housing practices through the Fair Housing Enforcement, working very closely with the State Fair Housing Office and the GA's office. In addition to that, we also provide resources for housing counseling and education. We do housing research and statewide policy work. And so I think one of the things that we're kind of keeping our eyes on is really the societal shift. I think there's an opportunity to have more integrative housing patterns. I think this is an opportunity for us as we talk about some of the lowest incomes and opportunities to have more integrative ways for low-income individuals, communities of color, and others to have a better quality of life. And I know that, this is a debate that goes on and on about NIMBYism and other issues and challenges around that. But I think this is going to really put us on a path and help us advance, the culture that's needed in affordable housing. We've been talking about this also all week long, about the racial inequalities in our homeownership rates and the gaps between white and Black and Hispanic households. I think it's an opportunity for us to continue to come up with some creative and innovative ways to be able to do that, because we know that wealth inequalities are the foundation of individuals to be able to have the opportunity to create wealth and for individuals to be able to sustain themselves and be able to take care of their households. And I think another issue that we've been looking at in the arena is some of the disparities around individuals that have criminal histories. I think it's unfortunate if someone has done their time, someone who may not have had an egregious crime are still suffering and being penalized because they've had a criminal history. And so this is an opportunity for us to really look at how we can work and deal with individuals who need a place to stay. Those are the individuals that are becoming homeless. Those are the individuals that do not have opportunities because they're being punished for a violent crime, and sometimes even decades ago. So I hope that we're able to kind of look at some of these issues and really identify ways of how we can continue to work together. I think Eric stated earlier that I think over the last 19, 20 months, we have really worked together collaboratively. The resources that DHCD has provided, Virginia Housing has provided, the federal government CARES Act funding. It's been a plentiful time, in this season to be able to take advantage of a lot of funding to do great work. And it has been a collaborative effort, I think, of all of us that are in the housing and community development space. So that says a couple of things for me, that we can work together. We can get things done. We have the tools, we have the resources, we have the collective creative minds, and everybody in this room can make that happen. So I think that we need to continue to focus on those things that we can bring about change for affordable housing opportunities, rental subsidies, a statewide voucher program, ending homelessness for good. And so everything that we need is right here. We just got to put our creative minds together and to make things happen. And so I'm hopeful, I am excited about the opportunities that we have. Housing has been the flavor of the month for a long time now, and we know how critical it is for families to ensure that they have safe, decent, affordable housing.
Thank you, Monica. Lisa.
Thanks. So interesting. I want to pick up on a couple of things that Monica said. I do want to be clear. In my role, I'm not a policy person. I'm not an advocate. I come at this sort of from an analytics side, and I want to pick up something that Monica said about homeownership, because I think we've talked a lot about how COVID has exposed to a broader range of people the disparities that exist in our society, in our communities, and focusing specifically on homeownership. We have seen that the housing market I don't know if you've heard, the housing market was on fire during the pandemic. I'm not sure if that made it to the media or not, but right. And as we know, and we know that, for example, housing equity has hit record levels. Folks who are existing homeowners have more equity in their homes now than they've ever had before. People were capitalizing on historically low mortgage rates, but we know that that hasn't been true for everyone. And I look at a lot of data, and you know, I'm not usually surprised by things, but earlier this year, was looking at homeownership rates by race here in Virginia, and the fact that African American homeownership is lower now than it was in 1968 when the Fair Housing Act was passed. And that floored me. And I think that that is one really important point that highlights this gap that exists, because as we know, right now the average white family's wealth is 8 times what the average African American family's wealth is. That 8 times gap, that hasn't changed since 1983. So that's 30 years. So these are persistent gaps that we sort of see in front of us. And so I guess my answer to the question then, as coming at this in this unprecedented era of resources, is that we have an opportunity to target resources to the folks who have been hardest hit by the pandemic and who have been traditionally and historically left out of the benefits, in this case of homeownership, and have been left out of opportunities and access to stable housing. So I will give one example that it's a little bit of a twist on this, but this idea of the resources that will go into broadband investment, for example. That is a huge deal, right, for places around Virginia that have not had access. And we know with learning from home and working from home how important access to I mean, I take it for granted, right? My son's on the Wi-Fi, I'm on the Wi-Fi, my daughter's, I don't know what she's doing, right? So, right? And I take it, and I've tried not to, but it's easy to take it for granted. So there's going to be a lot of resources that are being put towards expanding access in maybe some of our rural communities or communities that have been left out, and that is awesome. That is awesome. But what we know from the pandemic is some of those places that might have been a little bit more rural, a little bit further out, they saw a surge of home buyer activity from higher income folks, maybe who were working remotely, had some choices, had some options, and in many cases pushed up home prices. I was on a panel yesterday, pushed up home prices in places like the Eastern Shore and in the Shenandoah Valley area, so that local residents actually had a harder time getting into homeownership. So I guess I'm thinking about the unintended consequences maybe of the good intentions of, say, investment, and thinking about making sure that the people who have been left out, there's thought about how that is managed. The second thing I'll say is I think a lot about the demand side versus the supply side. And I know, not to take away what I'm sure you're going to talk about too, Andrew, but
Payback.
Exactly. That's right. It goes this way. Especially when you think about home ownership, I remember, was it last year where there was going to be talk about a home buyer, first-time home buyer tax credit to help on the demand side. But you can't help on the demand side if you're not going to increase the supply side, right? And so this idea of, we even talk about like a living wage and increasing the minimum wage so that families can have more income, so that the pressures of sort of paying for daily family expenses is eased. But if you raise, there's a study out in Los Angeles County that showed just this. If you raise the minimum wage without expanding the housing supply, then that additional income to those renters goes virtually all of it into the pocket of the landlord, right? Because they can. I mean, this is the way that it works. It's not a smack on landlords. It's just that's the way that it works if there's not an increase in the amount of housing that's available. So I would argue that as we talk about federal resources, as we talk about state resources, the one part of government I haven't heard us talk about is the local level. You mentioned NIMBYs. That's the second point I wanted to pick up on you, is that the extent to which we have additional resources to build more housing stops at the door of the Planning Commission on the Tuesday night meeting if folks won't allow the conversation to be had about expanding places to build housing. So I would challenge you all as working in your local communities to think through how we talk about the need for housing in the local community and how we address the concerns that some residents will bring to their elected officials about more housing being built in the community. Because I'm a housing, I said I wasn't an advocate, now I'm starting to talk a little bit like you here, but a little bit more because I am with you. I think there's this idea that housing is a fiscal drain on local communities. There are arguments that more housing will bring more school kids, more traffic, and I would challenge you all not to just throw up your hands and say, those people are just NIMBYs and I don't want to engage with them because they're racist or they're classist or they're them. I think it's incumbent upon us to be able to respond to those challenges at the local level and say, we hear you, right? It's obvious. You have more houses. If there's more children, there's going to be more school kids. Like, that is not an overreaction. And so the question is, how are we as a local community planning so that we can accommodate the range of folks that make our communities a place that everybody wants to be? So I would challenge us that as there's no more resources available, thinking about how we can be having more conversations at the local level and making the case for housing. The last thing I'll say, just looking ahead to 2022, is we do a forecast into 2022, so I encourage you to check it out. And one thing I think we need to keep in mind is we've been hearing a lot about inflation. Maybe another thing, maybe you've heard in the media, like 6.2% October. We also heard the word transitory. I think there's more and more evidence that inflation and higher prices are going to be with us for a while, and I think that's going to put added pressure on both the supply side as well as the demand side. And I think that as we think about sort of what's to come and how the economy is starting to improve, remembering, and this is, I'll promise I'm done, remembering that even as COVID hit folks differently, the improvement is going to hit folks differently. It's going to be slower for some folks. And the folks who are going to be most severely impacted by rising inflation are the folks who are living sort of paycheck to paycheck without those resources. So we don't want to kind of forget that even as the economy is improving, there are still a lot of challenges for different groups. So I'll end there.
Thank you. Andrew,
All right,
wrap us up.
The guy at the end, you guys picked that turkey pretty good. So my notes have gone out the window. So I think part of the question was key decision points. And for me, I'll speak to the state level. I won't try to even begin what's going on federally. But really seeing where housing shakes out on the long list of priorities that the General Assembly and the incoming administration are going to take. Now, quick story. 5 years ago, probably 6 years ago, a member of mine brought me a copy of a 1968, so your reference to 68 was perfect. 1968 Time magazine article, and on the cover, there was a guy with a really thick beard. He had cap and gown, just graduated college, peace necklace around his neck, and the caption said, "Can you really trust anybody under 30?" That's not unrelated to anything we're talking about. I just thought it was funny. Come on, you all got to, geez, quiet. I mean, it's funny. Can you trust anybody under 30? But anyway, in there's an article that says, why does U.S. housing cost so much? And the stuff they were talking about in 1968, is exactly the same. I mean, you could literally take the numbers, maybe bump them up a little bit, and it's 100% the same. Local land use regulations, building codes, labor, what else? Land cost, and a refusal of the federal and state government to really actually do anything to address housing insecurity and housing affordability. So how many other policy areas do you see where over the course of 50 years, there's not a really fundamental rehaul in how people are tackling a problem? So every year, we just got done with the campaign and election, we get mail pieces and TV ads that says, we need to lower the cost of health care, prescription drugs, right? What's the other one? Education. But how often do you actually, and most times they run on it, something gets done, and it's this huge showdown, and federal government, state government, General Assembly's there for weeks. We talk about housing, recognize there's a problem, but the conversation kind of really stops there. So for me, the turning point is everybody in this room and local leaders and builders and state folks who really care about this is, I think, for the incoming administration, it's not a partisan statement, it goes both ways. Everybody needs to really carry the message that we can't, another 50 years from now, be looking back at a Time magazine that says the same exact stuff that said 100 years ago. I mean, I just think that's just kind of ridiculous, for lack of a better, more articulate word. In terms of kind of a specific policy, Brian was talking about the Housing Trust Fund. A lot of people in this room last session invested time to create a housing opportunity tax credit, the state low-income housing tax credit, the 19th state to create a really innovative program, which at the federal level has put, how many units? We talked about this a million times, maybe 100,000 units.
Yeah.
In the last 5 years, probably 22,000 units on the ground in Virginia that are long-term affordable units. Well, General Assembly last year put that program in place, and yes, it was under a different kind of General Assembly and different administration, but this program really appeals to both folks on both sides of the aisle. And if we're really going to be serious about trying to put units on the ground, we need to leverage private sector equity and capital into affordable housing developments, because the financing side of it just continues to make it more difficult to get these units onto the ground. What else? I think some of my notes may have been salvaged. What was the second part of that question? Somebody remind me. 2022, let's see. Oops, sorry there. Oh, advice to, I guess it was kind of advice. So, this is a room full of people that are already active and engaged, so you can't just say get engaged. But personally, something that I've kind of tried to hone in on is two types of engagement that we sometimes miss. Engaging folks that are outside of our comfort zone. So whether you're a Republican, whether you're a Democrat, we kind of get into our bubbles and we talk to the people that agree with us, that recognize there's a problem, that want to help fix the problem. And then we talk about it all the time, and we go to the legislators and we go to local officials and say, right, there's a problem, and they agree, and then we kind of, let's fix it. And sometimes we forget that there's some people that, we just need to kind of take a chance. So if you're, local government and you're in planning department, go talk to the folks in economic development or environmental engineering and talk about how all these different things compound the cost of housing. Just go outside your comfort zone, I guess, is kind of how I would couch it. Kind of related to that is, I think we really need to do a better job, me personally, and maybe some of you guys are doing this, but going to the folks where affordable housing is outside of their comfort zone. So, some people, affordable housing, they're just not comfortable talking about it. It's not something they see in their communities. It may not be a priority. As everybody on here has said, housing is one of those things that intersects public safety, health outcomes, educational outcomes, workforce development. So no matter who that person is or what their priorities are, something they care about is going to interact with our stuff. It's a really long-winded answer, but, I got the microphone, so I can keep going. I think, having done this for a little while and really dedicated to the cause, I find myself getting into the rut of going to the same people, and we really need to kind of, I think, really push the message a little further. So I don't know if there was other parts to that multi-pronged question, but that's my thoughts.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, everybody. Just be thinking of your questions. We're going to look online and in person. The only thing I'd say to wrap up from listening to everyone, a couple other reminders, is that the General Assembly did ask two things. One, there's a House Bill 854, a study coming out. There was a stakeholder advisory group, really representative, and a huge thanks to Virginia Housing and DHCD team members and Housing Forward Virginia as a consultant on that, who have worked really hard over the past couple years. And the General Assembly basically asked for a menu of options of ways that the Commonwealth could invest in looking at what is the overall need and what are the solutions in terms of investment. In addition, the General Assembly asked the Joint Legislative Audit Review Committee called JLARC. And for those who don't follow the General Assembly, that committee is composed of some of the most powerful members of the General Assembly who ask big issues that they want to have researched and then provide concrete policy solutions to then make some changes. And one of the things there that was brought up, what they also in that study are looking at land use and looking at some of the underlying kind of zoning, and many local planners, local governments, researchers in this room were asked the very questions that this panel was presented with. So coming into next 2022, there will be two major reports that give you a menu of policy options, and it'll be up to all of you to decide what are the things you're going to focus on and prioritize. And it's a moment when, like many have said, housing is at a and the theme of our conference, home sweet home. Home has been everything during the pandemic, where we work, play, live, and where we've had to, so many vulnerable Virginians have really struggled to even be safe, right? So and stay housed. So it's a moment of opportunity. The last thing I'll say on the looking forward is that as an agency, the biggest thing that our funders at the federal and state level ask us when they're looking at more investments or changes in policy is, how have you done with what you already received, and what's the demand, right? So I would just say, all of you that are investing in unprecedented rent relief resources, investments in the trust fund and the tax credit program, the successful delivery and pipeline of projects is really critical for our funders to see solution and us being good stewards of delivering on what those resources are. So I wanted to make sure to say those few. So now we're gonna, it's your opportunity to ask questions in person or virtually. I'm gonna try to look at my virtual chat here. So if I'm looking at my phone, I'm looking at the online questions. But if there's any, raise your hand, stand up. If there's any questions, there's mic runners that are gonna come around. I see a question right here, Denise. Speakers are not allowed to submit questions online.
Hello, my name is Joy Johnson, and we're from Charlottesville, Virginia. This is my team right here. We're public housing residents, and part of what we're trying to do is to maintain the public housing we have, but to also build more affordable housing. Our problem is with HUD, and I just want to know from you all and to ask, can you all assist us to figure out how we can, deal with HUD? And how do you all deal with HUD when situation comes like that?
Michael, do you want to take that one first?
Probably need a little more clarification in regard to what the issues with HUD are, because we always have issues with HUD, I hate to say. But is it in regard to communication? Is it specifically in regard to certain regulations or policies?
So we are developing, we have 3 sites that we're developing. One is a senior building that is a rehab.
Yes.
And then we have a vacant land that we're putting 63 brand new units on it. And then the site that Ms. Oliver lives on has 58 units, and it's going to 113 units. But HUD is basically saying, we're not going to give you but half of the tenant protection vouchers so that we can help to relocate folks when we need all of those protection vouchers to be able to relocate. So it's like they're blackmailing us, as if you put back all of the existing public housing, then you don't get tenant protection voucher. And I just think that is so unfair.
Well,
Yeah. Well, first off, I would just want to thank you for your comments and recognize you for your recent award in regard to the work that you've done with the residents at Charlottesville Redevelopment Housing Authority. FAWA is a nationally known association in regard to resident services, and you all have been very impressive in regard to the work that you've done in regard to advocating for the appropriate housing that you need. So you need to be commended, and hats off for all the work that y'all have done. I would encourage you to follow up with HUD again in regard to a written notice. We struggled with HUD in regard to, when we did our renovation, in regard to access and tenant protection. And basically, we had to seek outside consultation and counsel. Yeah, and it's beyond what our capacity to do is. Basically, we got a legal counsel that previously was assistant secretary at HUD, and really understood the processes, activities, and was able to guide us through it to successfully receive the full allocation of tenant protection vouchers. So that's one option.
Thanks, Michael. And I just also say that really want to recognize Virginia Housing has done a lot of work. Their community outreach team, and they're really working on that effort to really focus on the state's role in partnering with regions, localities, and HUD in the work. And so I would say afterwards too, let's connect, because I want to make sure we connect you to the team at Virginia Housing, and also our at DHCD, our Affordable Special Needs Housing team with trust fund resources. We have a lot of work together to help problem shoot and work together. Thank you for that question. Next question. So I see one right there I'd already seen, and then here, so Jay.
Which one first? Okay. How do you think that the millennial generation at all income levels might shape the future of affordable housing in Virginia?
Any first folks who want to take that question?
I can start on the millennial question. I think that as we know, the millennial group comprises the largest sort of demographic cohort in Virginia and really nationwide. One reason why the homeownership side of the market has been so strong is the fact that this cohort is actually getting older. Right, so I feel like when we started talking about millennials, we were talking about avocado toast and like 200 square foot units and blah, right? The oldest millennial is 40 now. I heard the phrase geriatric millennial the other day, which is like totally cracked me up. The thing that we're finding too is millennials, again, talking about and I'm a Gen Xer, so it's not like disgruntled. We always talk about millennials, but we used to talk about millennials that they were going to act very differently when it came to housing choices and housing preferences and how we lived, how millennials lived. And it turns out that millennials were slammed by the Great Recession, by and large, coming out of school into one of the worst job markets in 75 years. They are now slammed by COVID just at the time, and the economic downturn after COVID, just at the time when a big share of them are entering that sort of marriage, childbearing, first-time homebuyers. And so they have been slammed a lot over the last decade and a half. The one thing that's been interesting, though, is as we look at how millennials sort of shape their housing choices, they end up looking an awful lot like Gen Xers, and they look an awful lot like baby boomers. They're getting married later, having children later, but those are economic rationales for that, not necessarily changes in preferences. They're buying houses later for the same idea. So I think that the interesting thing is that as we think about millennials in the housing market, that we can learn a lot from what they're seeing in the market given the challenges that they've had, but also keep in mind that they look a lot like other generations did. And so if we're going to expect some radical change in how people live because we think millennials are radically different than us older folks, it hasn't been playing out that way. That is not the question you asked, but I told someone one time if you can't answer the question to ask, answer a question you want to answer, and so that's the question I want to answer.
I think I'm a millennial, right? What's the age bracket?
40. Are you under 40?
Yeah.
Then you're a millennial.
Boom. All right, then I'm qualified to speak on this. How are millennials? To Lisa's point, and she knows a lot more data than I, so I'm just going to regurgitate what she said and agree with it. I think the economic decisions are similar to previous generations. What a lot of our builders, even some of the developers who are laying out these projects and trying to determine what kind of communities people are looking for, I think the millennial, maybe the younger side of the millennial generation, are looking for different types of communities than folks were at that same age 20-something years ago, which prioritized, fairly large lots, communities kind of out in the middle of nowhere, separate your residential from your commercial, from your work life, and a lot of distance between those two. And, when builders and developers are doing kind of their feasibility analysis, people don't want that. And even if they are a little outside the urban core, they want a community that's somewhat tied in with, kind of light scale commercial development with restaurants. They want recreational facilities. They want areas to spend time with their family outside of the home. And so I think when we start talking about NIMBYism, we start talking about, and I hate using that word because we just got to figure out something better to talk about or categorize them as. I think some of that sentiment that you see now where folks come out and say, oh, you're going to do 100 single family units. Absolutely not. We don't want that in our community because it's going to blah, 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 blah. I think some of the folks who are moving up and that will be kind of in the existing communities who will, get the zoning notice saying, what do you think about this public hearing? They're not going to really have a problem. I can't say everybody. They're going to have less of an issue with the idea of increased density or more people, greater sense of community. So, in 20 years from now, when we look back at that, you can be like, oh, that Andrew guy was totally wrong. It didn't change anything. But, you know, in terms of what builders and developers are here, and that's kind of what the discussion is people, I think, are getting less kind of about, you know, always driving the decisions in terms of the communities popping up around them.
Thank you. I'm going to take one online, then we'll go to Ava. I know has a question next. I'm excited to see a lot of questions in the audience. I was just introduced to that geriatric millennial phrase the other day. Someone called me it. So as you're processing being called that, just know the research said they were saying it's okay though because you understand millennials and Xers together. But it's a new term out there. So good question from the audience. The question online coming in is the emergency housing programs have been a tourniquet, so to speak, to stop the bleeding of evictions and foreclosures triggered by the pandemic. However, it is not the surgery needed to heal the housing inequity crisis that we have been experiencing for many years. Are there any long-term permanent policies or processes underway that you would like to share with the audience? Some of you have touched on that, but are there any, well, maybe we'll just do a real quick popcorn on something you think that is a long-term focus.
I'll take a stab at this, Eric. One of the things that I failed to mention is that there is a tool that HUD ruled on back in 2016 around small area fair market rent. And this is a tool that voucher holders can utilize, and PHAs, I know Michael is familiar with this, but this tool allows voucher holders to have specific payment standards, not necessarily tied to communities, but specific to zip codes and neighborhoods. So where there's an opportunity for higher payment standards, those would be applied. If there was an opportunity for lower payment standards, that's applied as well. And so I think this has been a push that we're starting to see across the country. About 30 major areas, some of the larger metropolitan areas are utilizing this tool to address the issue of affordable housing, to work with individuals that have vouchers. I think Brian and I have talked about, and he might want to chime in, on a rental subsidy. And I think that's something that we need to kind of look at because after all of the emergency rental assistance funding runs out, you know, what is going to be next? And I think it's an opportunity for us to look at, you know, having some policies and resources around rental subsidies.
Yeah, I mean, I largely echo that. I think vastly expanding vouchers and reforming vouchers to make them work better, because I don't think there are too many people that will say that vouchers work as they're intended to. So doing that, hopefully, you know, we can gain some momentum at the state to have a state voucher program that is, we've learned so much with the ERA and the rent relief program of how to have people opt in is instead of excluding them, making it difficult. But we just need to put units on the ground at a rate that you know, I think is achievable through mobilization of an alignment, but it's a two-sided thing. You know, put more units on the ground and make those units more affordable through subsidies.
I'd just like to add that you know, when you're dealing with a 2% or less vacancy rate in communities and hot markets, it's very challenging for rental assistance. So flexibility in regard to the programs and rent policies is critical. Virginia is very fortunate that just recently HUD expanded the Move to Work agency capacity, and it takes a little bit of time, but 2017, Congress legislated 100 additional Move to Work agencies, building on the legacy of the 37 additional Move to Work programs. And Move to Work is set up to be able to help test innovative strategies to address housing choice, family self-sufficiency, and cost effectiveness. So recently, 3 agencies in Virginia have been selected to participate in this program. Bristol Redevelopment Housing Authority, Portsmouth, and Harrisonburg. That makes up 4 different agencies, including Fairfax County Redevelopment and Housing Authority, that are moved to work agencies. So it's a very exciting time in regard to having the opportunity to develop policies and procedures to address local problems and to implement local solutions to those problems. We are in a very tight rental market in Harrisonburg. And so we are really looking at how we can expand housing choice for residents through landlord incentives, and increase self-sufficiency activities through reduction of recertification requirements, opening the door like what you were saying and opting people in. So it's a very exciting time to be able to see what policies could be implemented to really make some changes in people's lives.
Hey, and on the supply side, what are you all doing in Harrisonburg with the zoning?
Again, extraordinary times in regard to potential changes in regard to rezoning. The city of Harrisburg, and just the beginning of this year, completed a housing study which identified the need to look at all zoning and the impacts of those restrictions on development of housing, specifically the supply side. And so right now, we are in the midst of this zoning rewrite, and one of the proposals is elimination of the single-family zoning district. Be the very first in the state. As you know, it's modeled after several other communities, but it is very exciting times.
I'll just, on the supply side, it's basic arithmetic. Prices going up, you don't have enough, you got to add more. I mean, even my 6-year-old boy kind of got it. Walked in and said, "What are you working on?" I said, "Trying to get more houses on the ground." He said, "Oh, that's easy. If you got land, put a bunch of houses on it. And if you got a neighborhood, squeeze some more houses in there." I said, "Well, why, you can't, it's not that easy." I said, "Why not?" "Well, there's rules." He goes, "Change the rules." And that's kind of what Harrisonburg's doing. It's kind of like, it's not hard, even, and right, and so, right. And, 20 minutes later, he comes back with his friend. He said, "Benjamin, he'll put a, house in his backyard, and why don't you do what your mom does? She has, tiny houses." I mean, it's really, so, I mean, it's pretty simple. You just got to get more on there and remove the impediments to getting more. It's just, I don't know, sometimes I think we overcomplicate it, and it's fairly simple. Yeah. But.
Thank you all. Ava?
Thank you. I wanted to kind of pick up on the point that you guys just raised. Lisa had mentioned earlier some of the same issues that we're facing on the Eastern Shore on the supply side, right? We are experiencing in one of our counties a $100,000 increase in the area median sale price to about $360,000 in one of our counties, which is where I develop in the town of Exmoor. And as we are facing these challenges, we're trying to figure out how we also address the rising cost of construction and deal with some of these issues. One of the things that we are having to face is the issue of infrastructure against the backdrop of all that I just said. And I wonder how you guys envision the funds that are coming down the pike from the federal government being able to allow those of us who are in rural communities to address not only the rising costs, rising sale price, but also the infrastructure that is so needed to get the development done.
So I just got to note that people were having a little trouble online hearing the question, so I'm just going to repeat it up here. So, but talking about the rising prices and that jump of almost $100,000 in the county on the Eastern Shore, and in summation, working to ask the panel, and I want to make sure we just do this some real quick popcorn on here to address what are some solutions to addressing that, and so anyone up here want to take that question?
I'll chime in just on a little. This is probably not the place to start, but it's interesting when we talk about infrastructure, and we're talking about the Build Back Better program, and we're talking about the obstacles to building housing at prices that people can afford. Sometimes we think about the hard costs and sort of the building the house. I'd also like to throw out there the fact that one of the major impediments to building more housing is a lack of labor, a lack of construction labor. So the extent to which we can incentivize kids kids to go into the trades. My son walked into his high school, 9th grade, he got a packet. I thought it was going to be like where the cafeteria was. It was a packet about college. Nowhere in that packet was vocational education, about the military. There was nothing to encourage kids in my community to think about how a career in the trades is a way to actually become, to make a good living. And so I think as we think about infrastructure, I know we're talking about infrastructure, soft infrastructure, childcare, and all that's in the Build Back Better conversation. I think this idea of expanding on the labor side is going to be critically important to expanding housing supply.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, I agree. I had a conversation with Governor Northam a month or 6 weeks ago about the Eastern Shore, and he was like, we can't attract any businesses there because there's no housing. And I was like, well, let's build some housing there and then we'll get some businesses, right? And so I think one of the things that we can do to make some of those federal dollars go further in our rural areas of the state is there's a movement and some research that has just come out about how the income limits are calculated and how they don't work in rural areas very well. And so we're really limiting access to programs and resources in rural areas. So that's one of the things that we're going to be working on with some of our rural partners in the coming year. But, it's just, I think, tweaks like that and making sure that, the state is ensuring that there's equitable disbursement and use of those resources.
Well, thank you. I see several more questions, but I also we're getting closely on the time here, so I want to make sure the panel has a chance to say any last 30 seconds or less, anything you want to leave our audience with, and then I'm sure they'll be able to be up here afterwards to come up and talk with anyone. I think it's a sign of a great panel that that we could probably stay here another 2 hours and we wouldn't get through the questions of people's interests. So I'm going to just open it to everyone. If you have any last things you'd like to share with the group, parting words as we look to head into 2022.
I'll go ahead and start. I am going to push back just a little bit with what Andrew said in regard to the answer being simple. There is, to some degree, and conceptualize a simple thing, just build more homes. But the challenge really is the increased difficulty in that construction. With the added costs, the changes in regard to pricing, the increased requirements for layering of financing, regulatory requirements, restrictions in regard to water, sewer, all those things have made it so that the past HUD Secretary of State that it's even a greater challenge to develop housing than it is to do brain surgery. So, it's not a simple solution in regard to just saying that we could easily build more housing. It's very complex, especially if you're dealing with certain population, age group, income levels that have limited ability to pay for rental assistance or rental. Thank you.
And I'll just close. I completely agree when I talk about kind of just building more housing. It's the general mentality of how do we facilitate a really streamlined approach to approvals, construction, how do you offset some of those costs? And, kind of to close up, where are we going next? We just went through a crazy 18 months. We're in the middle of a crazy time. The economy's getting better. But when we're looking at housing, you've got 75% of the builders reporting that they've got low to extremely low lot supply over the next 12 months. So if you thought price escalations looked rough over the last year, just sit tight. If you thought supply was tight, it's going to be even tighter. We don't have enough lots to kind of keep going at a steady pace. And so everybody in this room, this effort, the call to action is, I think, even more dire than it has been, 6 months ago, a year ago, because I think the trend is even towards tougher times. So that was a really grim way to end, but it's just awesome. I'll say just great seeing folks in here from the local government side, from the development community, and the realtors, nonprofits. It's just when you can get this diverse of a group together, you really do something right. So thank you again, Eric, and everybody for having us.
And can I just add, just to build off that too, and I'll be very brief, is that my position's new at Virginia Realtors, and we have spent the last year talking a lot about equity and diversity and inclusion at the Virginia Realtors, and we have spent a lot of time putting together data and resources. So the extent to which Virginia has so many great resources in the housing community working together on this, I just want to make sure that you know that add the Virginia Realtors to your list, and if there's ways that we can be part of this conversation, maybe in a way that this particular association hasn't been in the past, please know that we are here for this conversation.
I know that Andrew mentioned the article in 1968. That was the year that the Fair Housing Act was enacted. HOME was enacted, was founded in 1971. So we're talking about 50 years of issues that are still going on. Individuals don't have access to housing. There is an affordable housing shortage. There are wealth and racial inequalities. There's a home ownership gap. I think we all need to be employed to continue to have the conversation, have the difficult conversations, but really get engaged in these issues because they're not going to go away. We're still going to continue to have these issues if we're not having those really what I call come to Jesus, courageous conversations on how we can address these solutions. So there's still more work to be done, but progress has been made.
I guess I'll go last, yeah?
Make it good.
A lot of these conversations make me think of a quote from Dr. King that's the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. And what a privilege and honor to be part of people that are working to bend that arc. And so it's going to take all of us together to work collaboratively with all due haste to bend that arc. So thank you all for being here, and thanks for allowing me to be part of the panel.
Let's give our panelists a round of applause. I have just a quick couple announcements, and we have the final 3D printer drawing. You have to be here in person for that, so stick around for just 2 more seconds. But I really, this was a great panel, and I really, there were a couple takeaways that everyone gave. I would just say, like Monica said, there's been unprecedented cooperation amongst all housing stakeholders during this pandemic, and there's such an opportunity in the moving forward on the long term. And so thank you for all of your work in that. And again, thank you for everyone for joining us both in person and virtually for this year's conference. I want to especially thank our hosts in this great city, our sponsors, our planning committee, our team of staff and contractors with Virginia Housing Forward Virginia, and the Department of Housing and Community Development, DHCD staff that worked to deliver this conference. The hotel staff was amazing, that they hosted us so graciously. And specifically, I would like to call out and thank Amanda Love and Pam Kestner for their leadership in organizing the planning committee. I also want to thank our federal congressional delegation, Governor Northam, Secretary Ball, and the members of the General Assembly for their bipartisan support of this conference and housing and community development. It really has been amazing to be together. And we can't wait for next year, so mark your calendars for Arlington County, November 16th through 18th, 2022. Save that date. This will be our second time back in Northern Virginia, and we're really excited for that conference and the region to host again. It has been an amazing 3 days, amazing sessions, great conversations, and one of the most important things, the exchange of best practices and innovative ideas and encouragement, partners, networking, friends, colleagues who can help you through. As we close the conference, we are excited to announce, we're going to announce here at the close our winner of our personal 3D printer. So maybe, Andrew, they can make that tiny home for your son in the backyard there.
Put him in your backyard.
And he can read the new ADU study from DHCD too. So this printer will come in handy for the winning organization. So I have the names up here, and I'm going to draw them and call the names. And I really want to thank Virginia Housing for their leadership in building technology. And I think Chris Thompson or someone on the team is going to come up and help deliver the award. So without further ado. Jason Wydell with Catholic Charities of Eastern Virginia. It's Jason here. All right. Got to be here for the closing plenary.
Oh, there's Jason right there.
Is Jason here? No. Harry Howe with not here either.
He left over.
Okay. George Davies, Executive Director. George is gone. George Davies with United Way. I'm sorry, Catholics for Housing. Ian White with Dominion Due Diligence Group.
If you know those people, tell them.
I'm gonna start. I know. Is Jeff Smith still here? I saw him just a minute ago. Oh no.
Oh.
Jeff Smith.
Jeff, just missed it.
Lisa Berger with ICC. Yes, Lisa. Very appropriate. Lisa, the International Code Council, is such a supportiveness. So Chris Thompson in the back, he will get you your 3D printer. Safe travels, everybody, going back, and thank you for being here.
That could have gone.
I really like your